Okay. Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Tonight, I have the honor and privilege of being with my Sheikh and Murshid, my friend and brother, Sheikh Wahid Azal of the Fatimiyya Sufi Order, and my brothers, Matt Douglas and Stephen Bayer of the Fatimiyya Sufi Order. So tonight, Sheikh Wahid returns for part 12 in these series of dialogues and conversations that we're having to educate the public. And we're going to focus on this toxic positivity that we have been battling, especially those within the Fatimiyya. And for all of the haters that are out there, for the record, Sheikh Wahid Azal is my murshid, my friend, my brother, and I am part of the Fatimiyya Sufi order. So there is no doubts or confusions about that. So without further ado, Nur alaikum to our beloved Sheikh.
Wa alaikum Nur, and also to Stephen and Matt. Yeah, you know, the issue of toxic positivity is one that actually some people were starting to address towards the latter years of the zeros, as the New Age movement was kind of beginning its decline in the way that I see it. But an angle that I think that needs to be kind of the angle the lens to contextualize what toxic positivity really emerges or reflects. We got to go into the history and the sociology of this. And I am with Max Weber and his amazing book that really formed my thinking about the West and capitalism in general in tandem with Marx. And that was his great book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And in that book, he touches on certain psychological features very briefly, but you know, there's room for kind of expanding on what Weber says. And that is toxic positivity as an attitude, right, is basically a reflection of perception management that is based on basically selling a product, right? So toxic, you know, you cannot sell a product in a market with frowns. Nobody's going to buy it from you. So, you know, you need to constantly have smiles and fakeries and that sort of thing in order to package something, to make it palatable as a product to sell to, you know, to a consumer. And this attitude has basically seeped into all facets of spiritual praxis, everywhere, even in the Islamic world itself and beyond it. But people don't realize the historical roots of a lot of this stuff, and that, you know, in previous ages, the approach to spirituality was a lot more complex and multifaceted. For example, one of the major figures from our part of the world, RUMI, is usually packaged as this sugar-coated, you know, a fluff and pluff kind of figure that is constantly just talking about, you know, a perceptively managed concept of love. Whereas whether you look in the Masnavi or whether you look in his Divan, Rumi, there in few of his verses, just, you know, lets it rip. You know, there's one particular one that Franklin Lewis translated and put in his really good book about his biography of Rumi, East and West, past and present. This is an exceptionally good book, probably, in my opinion, the definitive book on Rumi. And there we see, you know, the real Rumi. That the real Rumi was not this, you know, beatnik or new age fluff bunny. And, you know, this needs to be taken aboard. And this is why a historical consciousness on the issue of spirituality itself is such an important to unravel these sorts of things that we deal with, such as toxic positivity. So an attitude that wants to market something, right, is going to, by definition, market it in such a way that they can sell it, right? But toxic positivity as a phenomena in and of itself, right, is a form of spiritual bypassing. So it is actually a very counter-spiritual attitude. Anger, you know, or at least in its form of righteous indignation, not only has a place in a spiritual path, but it actually underscores it in many ways, because the world, or the dunya, in the way that the Quran and Arabic defines that term, dunya, is a place where injustice, tyranny, the destruction of rights, etc., is very pervasive, at least in this, has been in this several 100,000-year cycle of human history. And one of the attributes of the All-High is the just, or even the equitable, al-muqsit. So, anger emerges from that. And we have historical examples of this, whether in the history of Islam itself, beginning with the resistance of the Prophet, peace be upon him, against the Quraysh, and their own toxic positivity, which they were blaming the Prophet for. Why are you so negative towards our idols and our way of life? Why can't you just accept our idols as they are and our way of life in worshiping these false idols made of stone and wood? And had the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, yes, let's all get along, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya, we wouldn't have Islam today. The idolatry of these Qurayshites and these people who had corrupted the Hanif religion of Abraham, peace be upon him, would have been swept away, and Islam would have been just one footnote to history like everything else. Mm-hmm. So this is where you realize that this whole reality of toxic positivity is both phenomenologically counterintuitive and also historically counterintuitive. You see another example of this, very prominent example of this with Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, in Matthew 23, when he stands up to the scribes and Pharisees and doesn't pull a single punch against them and calls them a nest of vipers and this, that, and the other thing, then overturns the stall of the money lenders and users who are using the temple of his father to make money out of, right? Again, we're in the stage of capitalism. So in a sense, Marx is correct that material forces, right, not only shape the way that human beings conduct the general interactions with each other, but these modes of production are also simultaneously influencing the attitudes, the behaviors, and the perspectives of people. And capitalism, because of its nature, because it is incessantly and constantly trying to sell something, right, must by definition adopt this toxic positivity, the constant fakery and smiles and in order to sell, right? But it is not truth. It is the very opposite of it. It is counterintuitive. It is not what the path is about. The All High, for example, one of the names, several of the names of the All High that we have in our sources are things like Al-Azal, the wrathful, the angry, right? Or Qahar, right? And on these things go. So to exclude the reality of anger as on the basis of righteous indignation is actually anti-spiritual. And so in many ways, the New Age movement and derivatives who kind of thrive on this toxic positivity are in themselves, in my opinion, counter-spiritual and anti-spiritual. Hand it over to you guys then.
Sheikh, that is absolutely beautiful. And it reminds me of what you mentioned about Rumi, because I read something about Coleman Barks, the one that translated Rumi's works, that he had a certain bias, Western bias, where he removed all mentions of Allah, Islam, everything that refers to the aspect of finding that balance, where Rumi does kind of let it loose. So yes. Coleman Barks had his own agenda in terms of how the works was translated. So I thank you so much for pointing that out, especially this love and light and all this fluffiness that we see in these spiritual communities. And it's so important because we have to realize what it says in the Holy Quran, that both good and evil come from Allah. And you must be able to find that balance. Even the Kabbalah tree, good and bad cannot exist without the other. So that is very true, and I thank you.
But it also says, but we have to be clear about this. It also says that blindness and sight are not equal, nor is the darkness and the light equal, right? Yes. So this it is created by the All High, absolutely. But everything emerges from the All High. Both countries, all opposite, all paradoxes, all contradictions, they all have a single source, but they are not equal.
Yes.
And that is the difference. So the light is above the darkness or the negation, right? Just like sight is beyond, blindness, because sight can actually perceive. It can tell things, whereas blindness is in the dark.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheikh. And now over to Brother Stephen Bayer and Matt Douglas. Any thoughts?
I think some of the symptoms of when positivity is used to silence people can sometimes be summed up sort of like the see no evil, hear no evil monkeys that you sometimes see. And then like, if you don't speak it, you can just ignore the gorilla in the room, as it's sometimes illustrated in cartoons. I think sometimes it's also an elephant. I've heard it both ways. But the idea that there can be a giant beast, the problems of the capitalist system, blinding people to real injustices, but because they have to sell themselves as being available to buy in to, what currently is wanted in the labor market. So for an example, during the Iraq War, there was a wrestler who went by Sergeant Slaughter, and he sold himself into this odd caricature who bizarrely pulled a Rumsfeld and supported Saddam Hussein. That was his bit for a while. A really bizarre caricature to put on TV, but it was designed to get to children. Nobody really seems to call out that that was really horrible propaganda that was being used on people's television. People just sort of ignore the problem. Once the unity starts, it can be sort of a toxic unity that uses caricatures. And even when something's overtly wrong, like hits you over the head, like this image is problematic, people are more likely, what they're afraid of, in my opinion, is a blame the victim dynamic that's a misfiring of, sometimes it's illustrated as a drama triangle. And basically what that can be is a person is a problem when he raises the alarm that there is a victim. So raising the alarm is itself making the other people in that system victimized, and they flip it around and claim to be, you're a persecutor for alerting us to this negative stuff.
Yeah.
In the New Age community,
Absolutely.
I often see it represented in this pseudo hermetica that uses quasi-physics, not metaphysics, to misrepresent what positive and negative energy are sometimes. And while there is an aspect of how, gratitude towards the All High can attract blessings, that there is certainly an element of just sort of nullifying anybody with positive energy. I think somebody's invented I think it's actually called New Age bullshit generator. And it types out stuff that it misuses physics in a hermetic fashion to pull up these really bizarre, nice sounding, but otherwise empty Yoda, Mr. Miyagi type predictive speech. And it's sort of an example of the false mentor that Hollywood has programmed America to expect. And this sort of, I noticed this sort of pattern and expectation gets channeled down to the establishment churches and sort of the talking points of the Baha'i faith that often ends up going along with supporting the system and trying to bring up the, gee, there's a blatantly illegal problem here. There's some sort of support for crimes against humanity or being silent about annexation of land, and conflict zones, using it as proxy war for East versus West, which ultimately comes down to arms sales. That spirituality has a tendency to be used not to actually give energy to the call for justice and the rejection of how the system is dehumanizing people, but instead kind of acts sort of like professional wrestling and selling out when it buys into the system. So if you could go on.
Yeah, that's brother Steve, that is absolutely wonderful, and I'm glad you mentioned the things that you did, because you do have these elements, let's say like with Sergeant Slaughter and all these new age communities. It's all part of this toxic positivity that even Sheikh Wahid Azal has explained in a beautiful manner, and why we need to address this, especially with these different communities that we're dealing with that have attacked us in many ways. So it's up to us to stand up to this enemy through education and awareness. And I thank you for what you have shared also. So on to Sheikh Wahid.
Since I mentioned that poem of Rumi, I want to read this poem. It's a short poem. I'll read it in the Farsi and then the translation of Franklin Lewis, because Rumi has become, as we all know, he's become like the guru of the new age, at least the market. So let these people mull over this following poem, right? He says, and this is from the 2137th poem of his divan. He says, "On kun khar که از حاسدی ایسا بود تشویش او صد کیر خر در کون او صد تیز سگ در ریش او خر صید آهو کی کند خر بوی نافه کی کشد یا بول خر را بو کند یا گه بود تفتیش او هر جوی آب اندر رود آن ماده خر بولی کند جو را از زیان نبود ولی واجب بود تفتیش او خر ننگ دارد ز آن دغل از حق شنو بل هم ازل ای چون مخنث کنش او چون قحبگان تخمیش او خاموش کنم تا حق کند او را سیاه روی ابد من دست در ساقی زنم چون مستم از تجمیش او. And the translation, this is by Franklin Lewis, and it can be found, this translation, in Rumi Past and Present East and West, page 317 by Franklin D. Lewis. Here we go. So hold on to your seats. The donkey's ass, who in jealousy even takes offense at Jesus, 100 donkey dicks up his ass, 100 dog farts in his beard. How could an ass give chase to a gazelle or inhale the scent of musk? An ass smells an ass's piss or examines piles of shit. That ass bitch pisses in every stream she wades through. True, no harm's done to the stream, but you've got to drink from it. An ass feels shame from such deceit. Hear it from the book of truth. Rather, they are strayed further from the path. How like a whore's all his scratching. How like a fag all his flirtation. Shut me up. Let God forever make him shamefaced. I'll fondle the Saqi, the wine bearer, say, since I am drunk with her tickling. This is Rumi.
That is the Rumi, like you said. That's been censored out of all of these translations, and how the New Age was taking this aspect of Rumi out. Thank you, Sheikh, so much for sharing this. I loved it.
It's one of my. There's more of this. I mean, in his Masnavi, he uses, almost explicitly pornographic imagery to make a point about a greater spiritual truth. And one of the greatest examples of this is in one of the tales about the maidservant, the mistress, and the pumpkin and the donkey. I won't get into all the graphic details, but basically, the point of that story in the Masnavi is that there always is required an intermediary on a spiritual path, and if people go half-cocked on their own and jump into the ocean of existence without a guide, they will sink, just like the mistress sunk without realizing the pumpkin that the maidservant was using with the donkey. There's tons of examples of this. So, but see, this is the thing, because I talked about the Protestant, ethic of spiritual toxicity. Protestantism, or Protestant Christianity, has a very unique prudishness about a lot of different topics. And prudishness as an attitude has to present itself in a certain way. And this certain way, as Weber kind of puts his finger on, is precisely this toxic positivity that we're talking about. So this toxic positivity is also culturally, economically, and ultimately racially located. Because in all, throughout the spiritual experience of humanity before the rise of the West, and especially the permeation of the Protestant ethic in the form of capitalism, that particular form of toxic positivity, although may have existed in different forms, was not pervasive and was not a major, spiritual narrative, if you will, until now.
Yeah, I mean that all of that is super important, because we realize, okay, how did history got changed the way that it did, and the importance of having a sheikh and a guide and a murshid in our lives. It's like what I always say, that when you go into the ocean of Islam, if you don't have a sheikh or murshid by your side, you will drown. And we are lucky to have you as our Sheikh and as our friend and Murshid. And it's so important that we realize the aspect of walking each other home and the importance of having that teacher and guide in our lives, and why a lot of these spiritual groups take that because they're mixing Western individualism into those spiritual teachings.
Exactly.
And that
Exactly.
that shouldn't be so. So on
But
to yeah.
they don't realize that they're not actually being the individual because they're culturally conditioned. That this kind of behavior and attitude is actually a form of cultural conditioning. So there's no individualism in it at all. It's actually a very subtle and insidious form of collectivism.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's a good point because it's the aspect of culture and that conditioning being mixed in. So thank you for pointing that out, Sheikh. So brother Matt Douglas, Stephen Bear, any thoughts? Matt, you're
Matt's
unmute yourself. Let me see. There he is.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
yes.
All right. Okay. Well, we just just last week, which when we wanted to do this and got a little delayed, was Martin Luther King Day. And just as RUMI has been warped through toxic positivity, I think Martin Luther King is another great example of someone whose legacy has been twisted through it, always looking, they'll happily play the I have a dream speech, but they'll forget about his condemnation of the military-industrial complex through Beyond Vietnam and other speeches. I believe it was in that one where he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. This is also someone who, when it came to, since we're talking about justice, didn't just want simply getting along, but even said, and said within a month before he was killed, we're going to Washington to get our check, talking about the need for reparations. So that immediately comes to mind as one example of another individual whose legacy has completely been warped. And what it is it comes down to serving the establishment, serving those people at the top, because there'll always be a way that they justify their own violence. Often through some sort of need for stability and peace, or sometimes through righteousness that they deny everybody else. But it always comes down to, does it serve, these basically elite assholes? In which case they think it's okay, or does it serve humanity? In which case they think it's not. So if you're maintaining the status quo, therefore you're being peaceful because it's not disruptive. But all of a sudden somebody does challenge the injustices of the status quo. Well, suddenly we got to put them down, and it's just the right thing to do.
Well, it's also like the inordinate responses, that you see in conflict and especially occupation situation, like you found, for example, in occupied Palestine, where, a really decrepit, old, modified MiG rocket the whatever Soviet era rocket names were launched from Hamas territory. And they never hit their mark. They just fall outside a couple of paces from some illegal Israeli settlement. And all of a sudden, the entire IDF and Israeli Air Force is mobilized, and they are demolishing entire sections of Gaza into dust, right? And then the entire international media is mobilized to demonize these poor people that are besieged, that are being pummeled out of existence and into the cave period by a highly sophisticated and well-equipped military. And no one dares, and even if people are thinking this, including the people in the media landscape who are thinking it or feeling it, they do not dare, right, to assert the fact that not only is this an inordinate response, but, first of all, under international law, there is a right to resistance, right, of any occupation. This is codified under international law. Number two, there is no moral equivalency, as the fallacy exists today, between an oppressor and the oppressed. The oppressor is not the equivalent, is not equal to the oppressor, right? If the Zionists want to walk down that path, then they will have to step down a couple of pedestals and make themselves, which is a fallacy, by the way, but actually posit the fallacy of their equivalence with the Nazis. Now, we just know that this is absolute nonsense. There was no equivalent, no moral equivalence between the dastardly and utterly, mind-boggling tyranny and genocide that was perpetrated by the Nazi war machine and industrial killing machine against the Jews of Europe. But during this entire occupation over the last 70 years, the Zionist state and its propaganda arms throughout the world are trying to assert some kind of moral equivalent, even moral superiority of the right of the Zionist occupation in the kind of stuff and the ethnic cleansing and the dastardly behavior that they have shown to the Palestinian people. Now, I am no friend of Hamas. I do not like Hamas. I even believe that Hamas is a Frankenstein monster of the creation of the Mossad and Shin Bet itself, and there's a lot of evidence to that end, because they wanted to cut the feet from under the PLO back in the 80s. So they cultivated Islamic fundamentalism in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas specifically, and this thing went, out of control, just like the Americans did with Afghanistan, and just like they did in Chechnya, just like they did everywhere else. But so the fact is that the moral equivalency does not exist. Someone who is oppressed, someone whose back is against the wall, holds, at least from the standpoint of moral dynamics, all the moral cards. The one who is pummeling them, the bully, has no moral claim. They are not the equal of that person. This is a axiom within the scriptures of every tradition on the planet, including the Old Testament and the New Testament, not to mention the Quran, and also throughout the scriptures and holy texts of the Eastern religions themselves, whether we're talking about Buddhism, Hinduism, or Taoism, whatever. But in the modern and postmodern period, and particularly as we have moved into postmodernism, these moral agencies are basically in their causality have been deliberately turned upside down. So an oppressor, right, is actually looked upon as a righteous actor who is resisting these quote unquote terrorists, the native people of Palestine. Never mind that that is an occupation. Never mind that the existence of the state of Israel, based on the 1947 United Nations resolution of the Security Council, is actually illegal. A parcel of property was voted on by the United Nations in 1947 that made two states, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. And because of the 1948 war, Israel managed to take over all that property and then progressively moved in and took over the West Bank and Gaza from the 1967 war, then into the Yom Kippur, then et cetera, and so on and so forth. None of this stuff is ever mentioned. Yet the smiley faces of Israelis, and especially this Israeli establishment, I have a lot of Israeli friends who cannot stand the Israeli establishment, what the government is doing. So no one can accuse me of being an anti-Semite here. But the niceties and the smiles in the public media, in the perception that is broadcast to your average white American or white Canadian or white European, is that they immediately begin to identify with the Zionists. Never mind that in Europe, at least that in Germany, where I was living until 2019, that these people were anti-Semites and were the greatest anti-Semites history has ever witnessed. But when it comes to the question of brown people, Arabs, etc., all of a sudden, doesn't matter what these people are, that they're resisting an oppressor, but all of a sudden the oppressor becomes the hero. And this is one of the problems that postmodernism in the modern world, and particularly since the post-war period, has generated. And this is also the thing that fuels toxic positivity. So we can also now reframe toxic positivity as a form of collective gaslighting, or a form or a very particular facet of gaslighting, right? And this is what people need to take on board when they look at these sorts of things, right? Honesty, truth, these things matter above everything in any spiritual path. It doesn't matter where they're coming from. Even if a disciple, for example, sees the truth of a situation as against their murshid, against their guru, right? They have a God-given duty to mention this. Why? Because it is also incumbent for that teacher to remain honest, to remain grounded, to remain humble, etc. But in most contemporary spiritual contexts and ashrams and etc., and with all the controversies that we have seen, and it doesn't even have to be an ashram, it could be just a very basic business, right? Even though everybody preaches or tries to project an airs of equality and individualism, in the actual behavior of many of these people, they're actually reproducing and performing the behaviors of extremely authoritarian modalities and paradigms. And these are the paradoxes, these are the contradictions, and these things are evidence of the kind of poison pills and inversions, if you would, in the way that Guénon puts it, that are pervasive in this modern, postmodern world, and that are called ultimately not only counter-intuitive, but they are primarily counter-spiritual in every conceivable way.
Thank you, Sheikh, so much for talking about this, because what I see with the Mossad is one of their mottos is, by deception, thou shalt do war.
Exactly.
And if you look at the indigenous people, the real anti-Semitism is being taking place against the indigenous Palestinians, because the majority
100%.
of the Israelis that are there, they are of non-Semitic descent. There are Eastern European or Russian
Ashkenazis,
Jews, Ashkenazis. There's more Russian Jews or Polish Jews there than the actual indigenous people. It's basically a white settler regime. So the real anti-Semitism is being happened against them.
And let me underscore this before we get someone wants to get us into trouble with YouTube, because YouTube is very sensitive to this whole issue, and they take videos down right and left over it. The fact is, and historical evidence proves this, that under the Zionist regime, there are pecking orders of even Jews. We don't even have to go into the Palestinian issue yet. That Eastern Oriental Jews, whether they be Arabs or North Africans, the Sephardi or the Mizraim Jews, are not deemed in the society at large as being equal to the Ashkenazis. The Ashkenazi Jews are perceived as being at the top of the pecking order, and then the Yemenites, the Sephardic and the Mizraim Jews are looked at as further down the ladder, right? Now, most lockjawed Israelis will, they will protest all of this, but Israelis that I have known who have been my best friends, right? Many of them Mizraim, a couple of them, Iraq, came from Iraqi Jewish families who had moved to Israel in the 1950s. They all say that they were discriminated against growing up, that the Ashkenazi population would often not make a distinction between its own Arab Jews, like these Iraqi or Yemenite Jews, and the Palestinians. And that until probably around the late 1970s, 1980s, that there was always this airs of suspicion and separation between the Ashkenazi Jews that had come from Europe and the Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews of the East. And this is a very, very important point, because it also underscores the fact that Zionist ideology, given the fact that it's born in Europe, by its very nature is anti-Semitic. And evidences of Zionist anti-Semitism can be witnessed precisely in the kind of pecking orders that exist between and amongst Jews. Now, there are organizations, religious Jewish organizations, etc., that have attempted for a long time to remedy all of this, and there's a lot of good people. I don't include the Chabad amongst this group, but organizations that I knew and worked with in solidarity on other causes in Europe, they were fighting racism within Judaism itself. So they were fighting anti-Semitism within this greater constellation and greater community of Jews. And this is very important. This is what discredits any attempt, whether by the governments of Europe and North America or elsewhere, to attempt to claim people who are critics of the Zionist regime of being anti-Semites. The Zionist regime in that society that is extremely toxic doesn't even have its own house in order. They have pecking orders amongst Jews that they discriminate against other Jews. But you very seldom get to hear about any of this stuff, in the popular media, And it only takes, friendships and long associations with a lot of these former Israelis, as I have, whether here in Australia or in Europe and even in the United States, to realize that that society is not what it claims it is. And that it is because it is a white settler colonial regime, it by definition also has these discriminatory hierarchies in place amongst its own population. We haven't even entered discussions about class and socioeconomic background, etc. So one of the things that these people would always show me is that by and large, because there's mandatory military service in Israel, by and large, the children of Sephardic, Yemeni, and Arab Jews always get pushed into the front lines of the various conflicts, whether it be in the Palestinian occupied territories or whether it was the wars of 1967, or Yom Kippur, or Lebanon, etc. So they get pushed, and so the children of Ashkenazi families are always at the back. So they're always protected. These things exist amongst Israelis. And when I started hearing these sorts of stories is when I started forming some very deep, bonds of solidarity with a lot of, Sephardic and Ashkenazi and Misraim and Yemenite Jews. There are also those of them, unfortunately, because of this reality, who have become the proverbial Uncle Toms. So you have religious organizations amongst Yemenite and Misraim Jews that become even more right-wing than the official ideology, and who are all, overtly preaching the most genocidal forms of rhetoric, etc. So, all of this, has to be taken on board. And this is why this whole toxic positivity, in terms of this particular issue of Palestine, has to be basically looked at as a screen and a justified narrative of the establishment trying to push its own white supremacy. So let's now stop here and look at this and say very unequivocally that the way that toxic positivity has manifested in spiritual communities, number one, is a tool of an establishment to pacify population, as both Matt and Steve put their finger on. But number two, it is one of the forms of the behavior of white supremacy, beginning with its locus in what Max Weber defines as the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So, people who want to put niceties and smiley faces and avoid, the negativities and the realities of the world that most people don't, that most people want to look away from for assorted reasons, is a perpetuation of the supremacist narrative of the tribes of Europe.
Sheikh, I'm speechless, and I couldn't have said it better myself. And you are 100% on point with the clarification that needs to be made in terms of dealing with these toxic individuals that have infiltrated many spiritual organizations. It's a form of control, form of separation, form of different racial and religious supremacies, and we need to call these out as such, because there is that aspect of you have to address the darkness that is there too. It cannot be always nice all the time. And I was speaking with one of my friends who is he has his own journey, and he's like on the left-hand path, but he respects my Sufi path also. And he realizes the concept of good and bad, this duality that we're in, coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says too, he said, what I see in all of these communities, and it's basically those are the ones that are the perpetrators of the injustice, of the hatred, of the stuff, but hiding behind the smile, like many organizations that claim unity and peace and love and kumbaya. They are the real devils and demons that are committing the atrocities. So I thank you very much for this clarification.
So
Ergo the Baha'is. But sorry, Steve. Let me just put my finger on another thing, because this is very important from where we as the Fatimiyya are coming from. And this is the practice of tawalla and tabara that is a guiding practice of Shiism. And I'll quote from Muhammad Ali Amir Muezzi's book, The Divine Guide in Early Shiism, which I think everybody should read. He says, quote, for the Imams, bara'a or tabari is the indispensable complement to and opposite of walaya or tawalli. If we translate walaya or tawalli by faithful, tender love of the Imam, then bara'a or tabari would be wild, implacable hatred of the enemy of the Imam. We should be simultaneously mindful of everything that involves this opposition of Imam or enemy of the Imam, or the Imam's faithful believers against the partisans of the Imam's adversaries, as well as the corresponding pairs of opposites, the hyro-intelligence or nexal consciousness, aql, and those of the counterpowers of ignorance, jah. The battle waged between the two from before the beginning of the creation of the physical world, the people of the right and those of the left, the people of paradise and those of hell, the continuation of the universal battle throughout the cycles of sacred history between the Imams and their faithful on the one side and the adversaries of the Imams and their partisans on the other, the guides of justice and the guides of injustice, the guides of good and those of evil, the guides of light and those of darkness, the initiated masters and their disciples as opposed to the counter-initiated and their masters, the people of the exoteric as well as the esoteric as opposed to those of the exoteric alone, and so on. According to the Imams, one cannot fully love the Imam and his cause without simultaneously hating the enemy opposed to him and to his cause since the time of creation. The believer who is faithful to the Imam should pledge love and obedience to the master who initiates him into divine sciences, and hatred and disobedience to him who stands for the opposite of this initiation. If the world is the way it is, invaded by evil and darkness that will only increase until the triumphal return of the Mahdi, it is because the masters of injustice and the mass majority that follows them to isolation and suffering, unquote. And this is on pages 87 to 88 of Muhammad Ali Amin Mu'ezzi's The Divine Guide in Early Shiism, The Sources of Esotericism in Islam. And this kind of shows and underscores and highlights why this toxic positivity is completely the opposite of everything that we represent and that we're doing. And I'm also sending this message to a lot of, modern new age fluffy Sufis out there who, often wondered about, why I am the way I am. Your guest, my dear friend, Caleb Adams, got this right away about me, about what I'm doing, and that I am not a disciple collector. And thank you, Caleb, for saying that. Because these are the principles that we live by. There is good and bad. There is light and darkness, in this plane of history. That doesn't mean that the creator isn't one, or that the creator has a adversary in the form of the devil that the creator cannot control. The creator is Satan is God's ape, as far as we're concerned, is his pet. But nevertheless, in this spatio-temporal world, there is a duty incumbent on a person who is a true initiate, who is walking the path to the All-High, to confront these things. This is also part of our test. It's also part of our alchemical process of perfecting ourselves. That doesn't mean that we just slide exclusively into anger, but it also means that we don't slide completely into fluffiness either. There is a balance, right? And this balance, like I said, is an alchemical one by which we create within our own selves, our own alchemical body of ascension.
Thank you, Sheikh. Thank you so much. And that is, what Caleb was able to identify and what you pointed out, that is the absolute truth. It is that middle path that we walk, and that is the Fatimiyya Sufi order. And we are about love, peace, justice, but we're also about picking up the sword against the enemy. And that I'm glad you pointed that out. Yes. And I thank you for that. So on to Brother Stephen Bayer and then Matt Douglas.
Well, the example I used of fakeness, and I brought up how professional wrestling used images and how images are very effective at getting people stuck in that triangle of, oh, I don't want to be this part of this bad thing. So I think that there are definitely opponents of colonialism that are problematic. So for an example of white supremacy, I'd like to point out, there's some good imagery for the Texas Rangers in the media, but there's also a history of colonialism and at certain points wiping out tribes that they had competing claims with. Now, they will try to, clothe themselves as the protector of women, because I think one of the times that the Rangers massacred some Indians, they were provoked by some prisoners who were slaves who were being abused by their captors. But regardless, the colonists and settlers, they need a problematic opposition, and they use that imagery to whitewash a system of abuse that you know, is how they are there in the first place. So if one takes that and looks at Israel, one finds out that a lot of the people who protest against the draft are the ones that are the most discriminated and marginalized in society. Even when the draft has more people questioning it, they don't question it openly. There's sort of quiet talk about, do we want a professional army? They don't want it to directly question the system of requiring people into the IDF. And the image of resistance against the IDF is all of a sudden equated to various actions of Hamas and randomly firing rockets. There's many people who are opposed to the system of settlements and colonialism, who are not really have anything to do with the Muslim Brotherhood or its caricature of how it wants to twist its version of Islam. And I think part of this, we can actually take another way and see that in the end, the system of colonialism and settlements in Israel had an historical association allied with common interest with South Africa until apartheid ended. And that when South Africa had nuclear technology, it was because they had acquired that with working with the IDF. They were directly, essentially, gave nuclear weapons to the people that they were pretending. You know, now they want to pretend that we were a liberal democracy and we would have always opposed apartheid. Well, history actually seems to say that colonialism sides with the worst aspects of people, and that it requires a lie and fake images, and it presents these things that twist the truth. And the ultimate design is they don't want people worried where real racist abuse is because they're too eager to get children into the military.
Exactly. Actually, you know, some of these Israeli friends of mine in Berlin said that word for word, and particularly about, you know, a lot of you know, the Sephardic and Mizraim and Yemenite Jews, you know, that they were so desirous to recruit these kids straight out of high school. And it's also mandatory over there, so it's not an optional thing. And they were doing exactly the very thing that you were saying over there.
Brother Matt Douglas, on to you.
I'm thinking a few different things. On the one hand, you have, I think it was Keats talk about the, you know, in Ode to a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. Like urns and many other pottery made items, oftentimes I'm thinking of the Japanese concept where they would fill the cracks with gold. And yeah, truth, it's beautiful, but it's messy.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, if something's not messy enough, there's almost a false beauty associated with it, and that goes back to what Wahid was saying very earlier about you have to sell. You're always selling products with a smile.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we want to, you know, sometimes when we want to justify something, we polish it up, make it look flawless, and you know, therefore, you know, and naturally that's a lot harder to do for the oppressed because they're under much more stress. Things aren't always going to come out so nice.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, in order, though, we think we have to fight back by with justification. Whereas I'd almost contend that justification is the tool of the establishment.
Yes.
Now, I think the person who undermined this the best was Malcolm X, with 4 simple words: by any means necessary. He did not say by any means justified. He did not say that if it was necessary, therefore it was justified. He just said it was necessary. Now, people have to be free of oppression by any means necessary.
That also means it's that, I've been having this back and forth with this lunatic Scott Hakala on one of these Baha'i subreddits. They got me banned for a couple of days. But this is the thing that this guy needs to understand is that, from our perspective and from my perspective, because he's pushing this whole covenant line, right? Covenant, you're a covenant breaker, this, and trying to example me and several other people as what happens to people who break the Baha'i covenant. Well, I am explicitly claiming that the Baha'i covenant has no legitimacy. It is not a covenant. It's a fear-based control, mind control mechanism that keeps people in line within this organization. And so by any means necessary means that in that situation where you're in confronting such illegitimacy that is oppressive and is lying and is inverting everything and is the essence of negation itself, you break it by any means necessary. So how did that manifest for me? Back in 2002, I will say this up front. I took a copy of the Kitab al-Aqdas, Baha'u'llah's so-called most holy book, and as a ritual, right? I urinated on it and then burnt that book into cinders. That was the liberating act. And I even had a witness, like the 2 of them, to watch that happen. Because this thing is so oppressive. The reality of this thing is so oppressive that it is not even worth pissing on, just like that poem of Rumi says, right? This is the thing. In the Fatimiyya, I promote and I have made it completely halal for people, right, to confront this sort of oppression, whether it comes in the form of the physical form or whether it comes in the form of the attitude form, by any means necessary as defined by Malcolm X. So that means that tabarra and cursing the enemy who is inverting and negating everything, is not only halal, it is a sawab. It is a meritorious act. You are actually doing God's work when you curse and condemn that kind of enemy. And this is exactly what the Imams, peace be upon him, mean by tabarra. Now, to the mind of a toxically positive conditioned human being, including amongst a lot of Muslims, this is just like, wow. But I remind these people, look into your Quran. Look into that surah where the Prophet says, Tabba yadda Abi Lahab wa tabba. May the hand of Abi Lahab shake and shake, right? Which in the context of the time in Mecca, right, is an unmitigable curse. That the Prophet is cursing. When you tell someone that your hand shake, it means that your entire existence fall into cinders. And this is a surah of the Quran itself. So, the toxic positive is even within the ummah, you do not accord an enemy who is there to destroy you and is being an agent of fasad, or what the Quran defines as mufsida fil ard, a corrupter of the earth. You do not extend niceties to this sort of person. You do not, or forces usually. It's not one person, it's usually forces. An individual on their own can be dealt with, they can be coaxed and rationalized with eventually in some fashion and put that. But when you're dealing with an organization, a collective that is mafasid fil ard, corruptors of the earth in this kind of fashion, you do not pull a punch. You go after their necks by any means necessary. And this is perfectly halal. This is also a revolutionary ethic. That doesn't mean that we are suspending any form of ethic and morality. No, the ethic and morality, just like we said, is on our side. There is no moral equivalence between those who are perpetrating and those who are resisting the perpetration. And unfortunately, in these times that we're living in at the moment, this entire reality has been blurred, and people are, just like Malcolm X predicted about the media, people are loving the perpetrator and hating the victim of the perpetration, right? And this is what toxic positivity does. And this is why these spiritual communities who then perpetuate these narratives are themselves a perpetuation of the facade. And they are, by the definition of the Quran, mafasid fil ard, corruptors of the earth. It's as simple as that. And so in my context, by taking a copy of Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri Baha'u'llah's Kitab al-Aqdas and ritually urinating on it and then burning that book, this is an act of liberation. The Baha'is don't like that, too bad. I did it. This was my theurgic act, right? And in its own context, it is the same thing that Muhammad and Ali, peace be upon them, did when they entered the Kaaba and smashed every last one of those idols. That is what that act represents. And it is on that level. So this is the thing, truth, honesty. One of the commandments of the 19 commandments that all of the Fatimiyya adhere to is speaking the truth, even though it be the acme of blasphemous heresy. Now, nothing the truth with God is not blasphemous. It's only blasphemous to the humans who think that they have a market and have been able to figure God out. No one can figure God out. So there is no such thing as blasphemy when someone speaks the truth that may appear and sound like blasphemy to these shayateen, these satans in human body, right? But this form of being, this modus operandi that I'm saying, is completely the opposite and is extremely confronting to this mindset of toxic positivity and its locus in the Protestant ethic. And so they shun you and ostracize you. And then eventually, when you push hard enough against them, they come out and really show their true colors by defaming you all over the internet, making up stories about you, trying to set you up, like they did to Wahid Azal also in Aderne, as we've read from what Brown wrote, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you get to see what the basis and what the reality of this toxic positivity is about. And is exactly what you said, Matt, in that it is basically trying to pacify. It is a pacifying mechanism and agent in the face of, vis-a-vis the reality of oppression and tyranny in a given context, in order for the powers that be to pacify and shut down their opponents or any potential individuals and actors that may come to their opponents' aid or circle. That is what this is all about. It had nothing to do with spirituality.
And that's a great point you made, Sheikh, because even like the aspects of those that approach you with toxic positivity, but behind there is an agenda of destruction, like
Yes.
we have experienced recently with these people who claim to be love, light, unity, and happiness, but instead they have they're trying to entrap you into their snare. And these
Yes.
people basically, I realized in my life that they are the architects of their own destruction. Those that plot others' downfalls, those that dig holes for others. I've seen it time and time again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of all planners, and he destroys these people. And that is the teachings that we get from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Imam Ali, peace be upon them both, that in the Fatimiyya, we are taught to be truthful, to defend everything that needs to be defended and speak the truth no matter what happens. And what you have described, whether it's Stephen, Matt, this is absolutely the truth on how this toxic positivity needs to be tackled in today's time of deception and chaos and disunity. So in terms of, like, let's say moving this conversation forward, let's say in the post-2020 world, how do we identify and defeat this enemy when it approaches us?
By not holding back and not, now I should say this approach is not for everyone, right? And it is a very difficult path.
Yes.
Because, this enemy, whether in the form, in my case, whether it was the Baha'is or these fascists, are relentless. So you have to be prepared to stand your ground and hold your line by whatever means necessary, even if it means, astaghfirullah and na'udhu billah, that they come and get one of your beloveds, one of your family members, right? Even when something like that happens, you hold the line. It is just like the wars of Badr and Uhud. and the wars that the Muslims fought against these pagan idol worshippers of Mecca and the rest of Arabia. They held the line. They held their own line. I mean, they wanted to liberate Mecca. They held their line in Medina. These kuffar came to them. They defeated them at Badr. They had the Qurayshites had a Pyrrhic victory in Uhud, but expended themselves and their forces and their resources, and eventually they became ripe for the taking. And the Muslims marched right into Mecca, took it without firing a single arrow. Right?
Yeah.
But holding your line, you hold your line, you fight your corner. That is how these sorts of forces are confronted. This is what you're doing with your channel. It's what I have done in my own context. It's what Matt has done and what Stephen has done. And many of the people that are coming into our orbit are exactly, they realize this paradigm. And this is why Allah subhanahu is bringing us all together. You know, because we see this, we realize this, and we realize the fakeries and the plasticities and the toxicity that this other paradigm has perpetrated on this planet as a whole. And it's time for this paradigm to go.
Thank you, Sheikh. And, you know, this reminds me a lot of the sacrifices of the Battle of Karbala and how our beloveds, peace be upon them, stood up against this enemy without any fear of, having any fear of their own life on the line. So that is who we come from. Hassan and Hussein, eternal peace be upon them both. Imam Ali, peace be upon them. This is the leaders and heroes and prophets that we come from. And it's up to us that right now, in this time right now, if somebody does something, you can't flinch. You have to hold your line, like Sheikh has said, and put this enemy in his place where he belongs. So I thank you for that, Sheikh.
And since you bring up Hussein alayhi salam, I will repeat the hadith of the Prophet himself, peace be upon him. Hussein minni wa ana min Hussein. Hussein is of me and I am of Hussein. So good luck to those who want to try to shut me up.
Yes.
Because I'm prepared to go to the very end with this. You
Yes.
know? And moreover, beyond Hussein and the Aima alayhi salam, we have the examples of the Babis who fought in Sheikh Tabarsi, in Nayriz, in Sanjan, against the combined forces of the Iranian state of the time, and the clergy were out to wipe them out. And these heroes stood their ground and fought like lions to the last man. You know, that is who we are. This is our legacy. This is our heritage. And we are bringing this back into the world. And as much as these forces think that they put that genie back into the bottle, sorry, that genie is out in the bottle. You're not going to put it back this time.
Indeed, indeed. And for our brothers Stephen Bear and Matt Douglas for comment.
I think sometimes when I think of the Battle of Karbala and of Fort Tabarsi, I think of the example of Abbas, the brother of Hussein, who even when his arms were cut, continued attempting to do what was right. And I think of Mullah Hussein and his last stand at that battle. And this reminds me of what we have to do when it comes to the lies that normalize colonialism and white supremacy with toxic positivity. We have to take a stand against that because they will keep trying to appear normal. They will keep trying to appear on TV and try and take your children and force them into the next war. And his history is against them, and the triumph will be with the believers. And I definitely want people to be able to see clearly and be able to judge when to take that stand and make sure they know that they're not on the sides of these people with MAGA hats and thin blue lines who want to make the military industrial complex and the police state into the good guys and ignore all of the victims and blame the victims. That's why we've been given a mandate to protect the youth, and I want that to be in everybody's hearts to protect the next generation.
Brother Matt?
It also goes back to just what your tactics will vary, and they won't necessarily be in line with what you're told is the way to do it, because I'm certainly not the first person to say this, the oppressor will never give the education to be overthrown.
No, you have to get it, take it from it.
Exactly.
yourself.
And therefore, if you play by their rules, you're playing their game,
Or you become
and
a
you're
facet
going to
of them.
lose. Yeah.
Mhm.
So you have to go against what they're saying is the way to do it.
Yes, that's right. Education and awareness, which is what Sheikh Wahid Azal has always been teaching us, is to always think outside of the box and be researchers, be on these spiritual paths and learn. And the Fatimiyya Sufi order being the true aspect of unity and welcoming those with different ideals and seeking the truth and applying that to your life by having a Sheikh, Murshid, and also he's encouraging you to apply those teachings to your life and the aspects of yourself around you, but at the same time, not to tolerate any evil or injustice. So, wonderful points made by the Sheikh, Brother Matt, and Stephen. So, Sheikh, what else do you feel it's necessary to address?
I will quote from the Quran. الناس من الله وفتح قريب. The triumph is from God and the victory is near.
Inshallah, inshallah. I mean, this has been such a powerful podcast, and especially all of us together on the Fatimiyya Sufi Tariqa with our Murshid and Sheikh and with all of our brothers here. It is basically a message to the enemy, those that said, okay, you're not doing anything. We have done something. That's why they're all like running away with their tail between their legs and trying to set us up with these ambush interviews and have these random people messaging us all the time. So we identify you, we see you, we know who you are. We see through your fake smile and your toxic positivity. And we have put this message out there for those that are on the path of knowing how to identify evil when it's in front of you. And that is important. We follow the examples of Nabi Muhammad, of Imam Ali, Hassan and Hussein, eternal peace be upon them both, and all of them collectively, and what Sheikh Wahid Azal is teaching us on how to deal and identify with this enemy, especially in these times of chaos where there's so much deception and it's pre-packaged as such, even something that looks nice, you don't know what's really behind it or what is the ultimate agenda. So I thank you all dearly. I thank you all dearly, Brother
And thank
Stephen,
you.
Sheikh Wahid,
you.
Matt Douglas. Please, any concluding thoughts or closing remarks that need to be addressed?
Steve, Matt?
Any closing thoughts, bro?
Asked for people to pray for peace in Yemen and Ukraine, and know that we will always be told a lie about the conflict zones, and we have to look closely and avoid being part of the crowd cheering like a fool at a wrestling match when it comes to real politics.
100%.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Steve. Matt Douglas, brother, any closing thoughts?
I'd say just simply watch carefully, because oftentimes, for lack of a better term, the enemy
Yes.
or enemies, there's a lot of them in many forms, but they'll often come to you in the nicest of ways.
Mm-hmm.
They'll pretend to be your friend. They're not.
Yes. Oh, thank you for that, Sheikh Wahid Azal. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, this was a great one. This was a good one, and we needed to put this out there. Other than, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. No power, no strength is there but God the High and the Mighty. That's my final word.
Thank you, Sheikh Wahid Azal, brothers Matt Douglas, Stephen Bear, all of our brothers and sisters and friends of the Fatimiyya Sufi Tariqa. And let this be a notice on the record, for the record, against the enemy, that we're here, we're together, we're united, and we're not going to deal with your BS anymore. And we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And that's it. That's the bottom line, because our trust is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what the Fatimiyya teaches us, the commandments of truth, justice, and fighting against evil, and always standing up for the truth with our Sheikh and Murshid as our guide in these turbulent times that we're in. So with all of that aside, I thank you all. I love you all dearly. And I bid you all farewell with the Fatimiyya greeting of Nur Alaykum.
Alaikum Noor.
Okay.